The night pressed heavily against the tiny apartment, shadows stretching long across the floor. As Sarah Park sat on the edge of the worn couch, her body sagging with exhaustion she could no longer fight. The sound of her baby's cries pierced the silence again, sharp and desperate, filling the cramped space like a siren of need. Noah's face was red from hunger, his tiny fists curled in the air as if begging for comfort she couldn't give. Sarah held him close, whispering useless words meant to soothe, but her voice was weak, trembling, powerless. The shelves in the kitchen stood empty except for a cracked mug, an old jar of instant coffee, and a few cans past their expiration date. There wasn't a single drop of formula left. The bills piled on the counter stared back at her like cruel reminders of everything she had failed to manage. Rent overdue, electricity past due, final warning notices in red print. Every word was a reminder that she was alone, cornered, running out of options. Her phone lay in her lap, glowing faintly with the screen she had been staring at for what felt like hours. She had promised herself she wouldn't do it, that she would never beg him for anything ever again. But pride crumbled when Noah's cries turned into sharp, hoarse wails that clawed at her chest. Her hand shook as she typed the message. Ryan, I know you don't want anything to do with me, but I don't have a choice. Noah's crying from hunger. I need $50 to buy formula. I'll pay you back as soon as I get my paycheck. Please. It's not for me, it's for our son. Her eyes burned as tears blurred the words on the screen. Her thumb hovered over the send button. She hated herself for it, for reaching out to the man who had abandoned them before Noah had even taken his first breath. But what else could she do? With a shaky breath, she pressed send. Instantly, her chest tightened as though she had joy. Ishon. US signed a deal with the devil. She stared at the message bubble, small and blue, hanging in the air with all her shame packed inside it. But then something shifted, something wrong. Her stomach dropped. The number at the top wasn't Ryan's. Her eyes widened in horror. She had mistyped a digit. No, she whispered, her voice cracking. Her fingers scrambled across the screen, desperate to undo it, to delete the message, to take it back. But it was too late. 2 blue check marks appeared. The stranger had read it. Her pulse pounded in her ears. What if they mocked her? What if they told others? What if... A vibration cut through her panic. She flinched as the screen lit up. I don't think this message was meant for me. Heat flooded her cheeks. Humiliation stabbed deep into her chest. She typed frantically, wiping tears from her eyes. I'm so sorry. Please ignore this. It was a mistake. I'm really sorry. She sent it quickly, praying that would be the end, that whoever this stranger was, they would let her crawl back into the shadows of her struggle, unseen. But before she could even take a breath, another message appeared. Do you really need formula for your baby? Her throat tightened. She stared at Noah, whose cries had softened to weak whimpers, his little face flushed with hunger. She wanted to scream no, to end the conversation, to protect what little pride she had left. Instead, her trembling fingers tapped out the words. Please don't worry. It was a mistake. I'll figure it out. I'm sorry for bothering you. For a few seconds there was silence. Then the phone vibrated again, the screen glowing with words that made her heart stop. Give me your address. I'll bring the formula myself. Her breath caught. This couldn't be real. Her palms grew slick with sweat. Every instinct screamed at her not to trust, not to accept, not to open her world to a stranger. She typed quickly. Really, it's not necessary. Honestly, I'll figure something out. I'm sorry. The reply came back firmer, almost commanding. Send me your address now. Sarah froze. Pride battled with fear, and fear battled with the ache of love for the tiny life in her arms. Noah whimpered again, weak and hungry, and she felt something inside her break. She looked down at his face, kissed his damp forehead, and held the phone with trembling hands. The decision weighed heavier than any she had ever made, but one truth cut through all the noise. She would do anything for her son. The apartment fell into a silence so sharp Sarah could hear her own heartbeat pounding in her ears. Her phone screen still glowed in her trembling hand, those last words staring back at her like an order she wasn't ready to obey. Send me your address now. It was madness. Who was this man on the other side of the screen? What kind of stranger demands an address at midnight? She almost tossed the phone aside, almost convinced herself it was some cruel prank. But then Noah whimpered again, his tiny cry fading into a weak, pitiful sound that made her chest ache as though her heart was being squeezed in a fist. Pride told her to ignore the message. Desperation told her to take the risk. And desperation always roared louder when her baby was hungry. Her thumb hovered for what felt like forever. Then, with a deep breath and eyes blurred with tears, She typed the address and hit send. Minutes passed like hours. Sarah paced the living room, her bare feet brushing against the rough carpet, her eyes darting from the window to the clock to the door. She almost prayed it was all a joke, that no one would come, that she wouldn't have to open her door to danger. But just as she was convincing herself of that fragile hope, the sound came. Tires crunching gravel outside, a low engine hum, then silence. Sarah froze, her breath caught in her throat. Slowly, as if her body didn't want to obey her mind, she crept toward the curtain and pulled it back just enough to peek. Her hand flew to her mouth to stifle a gasp. A sleek black car gleaming under the weak glow of the street lamp had stopped directly in front of her crumbling apartment building. It looked wrong there, like a diamond dropped in the dirt. The car door opened and out stepped a tall figure in a perfectly tailored suit. Even from a distance, his posture carried authority, calm, commanding, untouchable. Two other men, built like security guards, emerged behind him, scanning the street with sharp eyes. Sarah's blood ran cold. This wasn't just any stranger. Whoever he was, he moved with the confidence of someone who never feared a locked door. He carried two large bags in his hands as he walked toward the building entrance, the security men hauling several boxes from the trunk. Sarah stumbled back from the window, her heart racing so fast she thought she might faint. This wasn't happening. It couldn't be real. The doorbell rang. The sharp sound sliced through the silence, jolting her like a bolt of lightning. Noah stirred at the noise, giving a soft cry. Sarah's hands shook as she tucked him deeper into his makeshift crib. Her legs felt heavy as she walked toward the door, each step slower than the last. Her mind screamed at her, "Don't open it. Don't do this. Call the police. Hide." But another voice whispered, "He brought food. He brought hope." She stopped in front of the door, pressed her palm flat against the cool wood, and closed her eyes for a moment. Then, with a trembling breath, she turned the handle and pulled it open. The hallway light spilled in, and for the first time she saw him up close. He was taller than she expected, broad-shouldered, with sharp features that carried both power and restraint. His eyes, dark, focused, unreadable, met hers instantly. For a moment, neither of them spoke. "You're—" Sarah's voice cracked. Her throat was too dry to finish the sentence. "Richard Walker," he said simply, his voice low, steady, and strangely calm, as if his presence there in her doorway at midnight was the most natural thing in the world. The name hit her like a wave. Richard Walker. She knew that name. Everyone in the city did. He wasn't just wealthy, he was the Richard Walker, CEO of Walker Enterprises, the same place where she had been scrubbing floors only 2 weeks ago. Her grip tightened on the doorframe as her knees threatened to give way. What was he doing here? How had she made this mistake? "I brought these." He held out the bags, his tone almost casual. "Milk, diapers, some clothes, and a few things I thought might help." Sarah stared at the bags, too stunned to reach for them. Shame and gratitude collided in her chest, leaving her paralyzed. Finally, she reached out, her hands brushing against his as she took the weight of the bags. The warmth of his touch startled her. Inside, Noah whimpered again, a soft, exhausted cry. Richard's eyes flicked past Sarah's shoulder, his expression hard, softening for the first time as he caught sight of the baby. Something shifted in his gaze, less steel, more shadow, almost like a memory stirred behind his calm exterior. "May I come in?" he asked quietly. Sarah's breath caught. Everything in her told her to say no, to shut the door, to guard the fragile world she and Noah had managed to build. But something else, something she didn't understand, made her step aside. She opened the door wider, just enough. Richard entered, his polished shoes clicking softly against the worn linoleum. The contrast between him and the shabby apartment was stark, like two worlds colliding in silence. He placed the boxes gently by the couch, then straightened, his eyes scanning the small space, not with judgment, but with the careful attention of a man who noticed everything. For the first time in months, Sarah felt like her life had slipped out of her hands, like she was standing at the edge of something far bigger than she could see, and deep in her chest, fear and hope tangled together, leaving her breathless. Richard turned back to her, his expression unreadable. Then in that same steady voice that sounded almost like a command, he said, "You shouldn't be living like this. I want to make you an offer." Sarah's stomach nodded. An offer? She swallowed hard, her pride screaming while her heart whispered, "Listen." And that was the moment she realized her life was no longer the same. The sun was just beginning to rise when Sarah found herself staring at her reflection in the bathroom mirror. a nervous hand tugging at the edge of her plain white blouse. She had washed it 3 times already, the fabric thinner with every scrub, but it was the best she had. Her black trousers were a size too loose, cinched with an old belt, and her flats were scuffed, though she had polished them the night before until her fingers ached. Her appearance didn't scream executive assistant, it barely whispered office worker. But this morning wasn't about appearances, it was about courage. Noah stirred softly in his crib, his little face calm for once, and Sarah bent down to kiss his forehead. "I'm doing this for you," she whispered, her voice steady despite the storm in her chest. Then, with her neighbor Mrs. Margaret watching over him, Sarah walked out of the apartment and into a future she couldn't yet imagine. The Walker Enterprises building loomed above her like a glass giant scraping the clouds. Its polished exterior mirrored the morning sky, an image of success and power. Sarah swallowed hard as she stepped through the gleaming glass doors, the lobby buzzing with people who seemed to belong in magazines rather than real life. Perfect suits, polished shoes, confident strides. She tightened her grip on her bag, forcing herself not to falter. The receptionist smiled politely when Sarah gave her name, but there was a flicker of surprise in the woman's eyes. "You're expected," she said quickly, pointing her toward a set of elevators. "Top floor, room 28. As the elevator climbed, Sarah's reflection stared back at her from the mirrored walls. Every second that passed made her feel smaller, more exposed, like an imposter about to be unmasked. By the time the doors slid open, her hands were slick with sweat. Richard was waiting. He stood by his desk, sleeves rolled neatly to his forearms, a stack of files in front of him. When he saw her, he gave a small approving nod. "Right on time, I like that." Sarah's heart skipped. She muttered a nervous, "Good morning," and sat where he gestured, her fingers clasped tightly in her lap. "Starting today," Richard began, his tone calm but firm. "You'll be my personal assistant. Scheduling, meeting coordination, contracts, travel, everything that keeps this office running. You'll learn quickly, I have no doubt." Sarah blinked, barely able to absorb the weight of his words. She wanted to protest, to confess she wasn't qualified, but his steady gaze left no room for doubt. He believed in her, more than she believed in herself. Her training began instantly. Richard handed her a sleek tablet loaded with his schedule, contracts, and company documents. Every line of text looked like a foreign language at first. She scribbled notes furiously, asked questions when she dared, and tried to keep her nerves from showing. By midday, she already felt overwhelmed. Names, acronyms, and deadlines swirled in her head. She excused herself to the restroom just to splash cold water on her face, whispering, "You can do this, for Noah." But back in the office, the whispers had already started. "Isn't that the cleaning lady?" one secretary whispered, not nearly quiet enough. "How is she now working for the CEO?" another replied, her tone sharp with suspicion. "Something's not right," a third muttered, folding her arms. Sarah's cheeks burned, but she kept her head high. She had survived worse than gossip. The day stretched on, and with it came small victories. She memorized Richard's meeting order, handled her first phone call without stumbling, and even caught a scheduling error before it caused a clash with the board. Richard noticed. At one point, he leaned across the desk, glanced at her neatly written notes, and gave a small, approving smile. "You're faster than most of the assistants I've had," he said. The praise sent a strange warmth through her chest. She lowered her eyes, embarrassed, but couldn't stop a faint smile from tugging at her lips. Still, not everything could be brushed aside so easily. That afternoon, as she was filing documents, her phone buzzed in her pocket. She slipped it out, and her stomach dropped. A message from Ryan. "So you're cozying up with rich folks now? Cute. But don't forget, I'm still Noah's father." Her hands trembled. She shoved the phone back into her pocket, hoping Richard hadn't noticed her expression. But when she looked up, his eyes were on her. Concern flickered there, though he said nothing. Sarah forced herself to focus on the work, burying her panic beneath the rhythm of tasks. But Ryan's words echoed in her mind like a threat waiting to bloom. As the office quieted that evening, Richard called her over. He stood by the window, city lights flickering below like stars trapped in glass. "How was your first day?" he asked, his tone softer now. Sarah hesitated, then admitted, "Overwhelming. Everyone knows I don't belong here." Richard turned toward her, his expression firm. "Don't ever say that again. You do belong here. You proved it today." The conviction in his voice stole her breath. For a moment, she forgot the gossip, the fear, even Ryan's threats. For a moment, she felt safe. But safety was fragile. The next morning, as Sarah worked through spreadsheets, her eyes caught something strange. A line of numbers that didn't add up. At first, she thought it was a mistake. Maybe she was still learning. But as she traced the pattern, her pulse quickened. Small, hidden amounts, repeated across several months. She bit her lip, glancing toward Richard, who was busy reviewing contracts. Should she say something? Would he laugh at her for noticing? Or worse, would he fire her for prying where she didn't belong? Her phone buzzed again, another message from Ryan. If you don't want trouble, you'd better help me out, or I'll see you in court for custody. Her blood ran cold. 2 threats now loomed over her, one personal, one professional, and both felt like storms waiting to break. Sarah clenched her fists, took a steadying breath, and made a choice. She would tell Richard about the numbers, about everything. Because if she had learned one thing in the past 48 hours, it was this. Secrets had a way of destroying you, and she couldn't afford any more destruction. The office was quiet, almost too quiet. The hum of computers and the muted tick of the wall clock fills the space with an uneasy rhythm. Sarah sat at her desk, her fingers trembling over the keyboard. The spreadsheet glared back at her, its columns and rows stretching endlessly, but her eyes were locked on one line, a figure that didn't belong. At first, she thought fatigue was tricking her, but the more she traced the numbers, the more her stomach twisted. It wasn't a typo, it was deliberate. She clicked through older files, her pulse quickening. There it was again, a small transaction, buried beneath legitimate ones, masked to look ordinary. One line by itself meant nothing, but strung together over months, it became something else entirely, a siphon. She looked up. Richard was across the room, reviewing a contract with his sleeves rolled high, brows furrowed. He looked calm, in control, the very image of power. But Sarah knew what she was seeing could rip that image to pieces. Her throat tightened as she whispered, "Mr. Walker, I think there's something you need to see." Richard strode over, his shadow falling across her desk. Sarah pointed to the highlighted figures, her voice shaking. "This isn't right. These amounts, they're too consistent, too hidden, and they've been happening for months." Richard bent over her shoulder, his jaw tightening as his eyes scanned the screen. For a long moment, he said nothing. Then, with a heavy exhale, he muttered, "Damn it." Her stomach lurched. "So it's real?" His silence was answer enough. He pulled another chair beside her, logging into the system himself, his hands flying over the keys with controlled urgency. One file, then another. Each one revealed more red flags, tiny transfers, suspicious invoices, accounts with no clear owners. "This isn't a mistake," he said finally, his voice deep and edged with steel. "This is theft, calculated, covered up." Sarah swallowed hard. Who would have access to do something like this? Richard's eyes darkened. "Only 3 people. Myself, the CFO, and William Carter." The name dropped like a stone between them. Sarah glanced at him. She had heard the name whispered around the office. William, the co-founder, Richard's right hand, the man he had known for over a decade. To even suggest betrayal from him felt unthinkable, and yet the numbers didn't lie. "You think it's him?" Sarah said softly. Richard leaned back, crossing his arms. For the first time, Sarah saw not the confident CEO, but a man carrying the weight of disbelief and disappointment. "I don't want to think so," he admitted, "but everything points to him." Before Sarah could respond, the office door burst open. 3 board members entered, their expressions stiff, followed by a corporate lawyer carrying a thick folder. Richard shot to his feet. "What the hell is this?" The eldest director, a sharp-eyed man with silver hair, placed the folder on the desk with a thud. "We've received troubling reports, Richard. Financial irregularities, millions funneled into offshore accounts, under your authorization." Sarah's blood went cold. "That's impossible," Richard snapped. "I never signed off on any such transfers." The lawyer slid the folder open. Pages of records stared back, each stamped, each traced to Richard's login credentials. To anyone else, it was damning evidence. Sarah stepped forward, her voice breaking. "Wait, no, you don't understand. We've been looking into this. It's a setup." Richard raised a hand, stopping her. His eyes never left the director's. "You actually believe I'd steal from my own company?" The director's voice was like ice. "Until this is resolved, you're suspended from your position as President and CEO, effective immediately." The words hit like a hammer. Sarah felt her knees weaken. Richard clenched his jaw, his fists curling at his sides. For a long moment, he said nothing, just stared at the men who had once been his allies. Finally, he muttered through gritted teeth, "You're making a mistake, and I will prove it." The directors left, their footsteps echoing like a death sentence down the hall. When the door shut, silence swallowed the room. Sarah's heart pounded so loudly she thought it might break her ribs. "What do we do?" she whispered. Richard turned to her, his eyes sharp, unyielding. We fight harder than ever. But even as he said it, Sarah's phone buzzed. She pulled it out, her stomach dropping at the name on the screen. Ryan. Her hands shook as she read the message. Looks like your fancy new boss is in trouble. Maybe it's time you remembered who Noah's father really is. I'll be filing for custody soon, unless you help me out. She felt sick. Ryan knew. He was circling like a vulture, waiting for weakness. Richard noticed the change in her expression. What is it? Sarah tried to hide the phone, but he reached out, gently but firmly pulling it from her hand. His jaw tightened as he read the words. For a moment, his calm broke, and raw anger flashed in his eyes. He gripped the phone so hard, Sarah thought it might crack. They're working together, he said, his voice low, dangerous. William and Ryan. It's too clean, too perfectly timed. Sarah's breath caught. But why? Why me? Richard met her eyes. Because you're the closest thing I have to a weakness, and because they know you're stronger than they expected. Her chest tightened. She wanted to deny it, to say she was just a woman trying to feed her child, but something in Richard's gaze told her he meant every word. He stepped closer, lowering his voice, his presence steadying her even as her world spun out of control. Listen to me, Sarah. They want us scared. They want us to break. We won't. Not you. Not me. She nodded, though her hands still trembled. That night, the two of them sat in her small apartment, papers and files spread across the table. Richard paced, his mind a storm of strategy, while Sarah pored over numbers, her eyes sharp, her notes precise. Noah slept soundly nearby, unaware of the storm raging just beyond his crib. At one point, Richard stopped pacing and looked at her. I need you with me on this. If you want out, say so now. Sarah met his gaze. The fear inside her was real, but so was the fire. She clenched her fists, lifted her chin, and said, I'm not going anywhere. A faint smile tugged at his lips, not of amusement, but of pride. He leaned forward, resting his hands on the table, his voice low and resolute. Then it's us against them. And I promise you, Sarah, we're going to win. But deep down, both of them knew one truth. The enemy was already closer than they realized. The apartment looked nothing like it usually did. Instead of toys on the rug or baby bottles lined up on the counter, the small space had transformed into a war room. Papers sprawled across the table, laptops hummed with open files, and sticky notes covered the wall in a frantic attempt to piece together a puzzle too large for comfort. Sarah sat at the table, her hair pulled back, eyes sharp as she scribbled numbers and arrows across a notepad. Richard paced behind her, phone pressed to his ear, his jaw tense. Every few seconds, his gaze darted toward Noah, who was asleep in his crib, blissfully unaware of the storm brewing around him. Tomorrow, Richard said into the phone, his voice low and steady. Yes, we'll have everything ready. Just make sure your team is in position. He hunt. G up, exhaling sharply. Sarah looked up. The FBI? He nodded, his expression unreadable. They're in. They'll move the moment William takes the bait. Her stomach clenched. The words sounded simple, but nothing about this felt simple. They weren't talking about numbers on a screen anymore. They were talking about taking down one of the most powerful men in the company, a man Richard once called his brother. What if it doesn't work? She whispered, more to herself than to him. Richard stopped pacing. His eyes softened for the first time that night. It will, because we don't have a choice. She wanted to believe him. She wanted to hold on to that certainty, but fear pressed heavy in her chest. She turned back to the papers, trying to bury her doubt in the work. Hours passed. They barely spoke, communicating instead through quick glances and the scribble of pens. Yet something had shifted between them. The silence wasn't just professional, it was charged, alive. Every time Richard leaned over her shoulder to read a figure, she felt the heat of his presence. Every time she met his eyes, her heart betrayed her with a sudden, unsteady rhythm. At one point, he set a hand on hers, stilling her frantic writing. Sarah, he said quietly, you've done more for this company in 2 weeks than most people do in a lifetime. I need you to hear that. Her throat tightened. She blinked, fighting tears she didn't have the strength to shed. I'm just trying to survive. His gaze lingered, heavy and unflinching. No, you're fighting, and you're winning. Before she could respond, her phone buzzed violently on the table. The screen lit up with a name that turned her blood cold. Ryan. Clock's ticking. You don't want me in court, Sarah. Unless you want to lose Noah, you'll play nice. Remember, I've got people on my side now. Her hand trembled as she lowered the phone. He won't stop, she wet. Spared. Richard's jaw clenched. He snatched the phone, read the message, and for a moment fury burned across his face, raw and unmasked. "He's finished," Richard growled. "Both of them. William and Ryan. Tomorrow, they'll have nowhere left to hide." The next morning, the Walker Enterprises building pulsed with unease. Sarah could feel it the moment she stepped through the revolving doors. The employees moved quickly, whispering in corners, their eyes flicking toward her and Richard with suspicion. Rumors of Richard's suspension had spread, and William's shadow loomed over the halls like a storm cloud. Sarah's pulse raced as she entered the boardroom. Richard stood tall beside her, his suit immaculate, his expression carved from stone. On the table lay a set of documents, fake contracts, fake mergers, fake numbers, all crafted to look like the deal of a lifetime. William walked in minutes later, smiling as though nothing in the world could touch him. His tailored suit was perfect, his cufflinks gleamed, and his eyes flicked between Richard and Sarah with calculated arrogance. "So," he drawled, sliding into his chair, "we're back to business?" "Something like that," Richard replied, his tone cool. William skimmed the contracts, his smirk widening. Impressive numbers, almost too good to pass up. Sarah's heart pounded. She forced herself to stay calm, to look down at her notes instead of at the FBI agents disguised as IT staff in the corner of the room. Every second stretched into eternity. "Tell me," William said, glancing at her. "Did the assistant draft these figures? Cute. Looks like she's learning fast." Sarah stiffened but said nothing. Richard's hand brushed against hers under the table, subtle, steadying. William's fingers danced over his laptop keys, entering codes, authorizing transactions. He thought he was moving millions into his hidden accounts. What he didn't know was that every keystroke was being tracked, mirrored, and logged by federal agents waiting just outside. The air shifted. Sarah felt it before she heard it. The faint shuffle of footsteps in the hallway, the sudden stillness in the room as the agents received their signal. Then the door burst open. "William Carter, you are under arrest for fraud, embezzlement, and conspiracy." The words rang out like thunder. FBI agents stormed the room, their badges flashing, their voices sharp. William's chair screeched against the floor as he jumped to his feet, his face draining of color. "This is a mistake," he shouted, his voice cracking. "You can't do this. I built this company." Richard crossed his arms, his expression cold. "No, you stole from it, and from me." As the agents cuffed him, William's eyes locked on Sarah, venom burning in his gaze. "This isn't over," he spat. "You'll regret siding with him." Sarah's stomach nodded, but she held his stare. For the first time, she wasn't the woman begging for scraps. She was the one standing tall. William was dragged out, his protests echoing down the hall. The boardroom fell silent. Sarah realized her hands were shaking, her breath uneven, but before panic could swallow her, Richard stepped closer. He reached for her hand, gripping it tightly, his voice steady. "You did it," he said softly. "We did it." Her chest tightened. She wanted to believe it was over, but deep down, she knew there was still Ryan. The thought lingered like a shadow. As if reading her mind, Richard added, "And now it's his turn." Sarah's phone buzzed again. A new message lit up the screen. "You think this changes anything? I'll take Noah. You'll see. You can't stop me." Her breath caught. Her hands shook. But before fear could root her in place, Richard gently cupped her face, forcing her to meet his eyes. "You're not alone anymore, Sarah," he said, his voice deep, unyielding. "I won't let anyone touch you or your son, not ever." The world seemed to fade around them. For a moment, it was just the two of them, her fear colliding with his certainty, her trembling met by his steady strength, and in that moment, Sarah realized something terrifying and undeniable. She trusted him, with her son, with her life, with everything. But as powerful as that realization was, she also knew the war wasn't over. William might be gone, but Ryan was still out there, and the next battle would be the most personal of all. The night after William's arrest, the city felt restless. The headlines screamed, "Walker Enterprises executive arrested in fraud scandal." Cameras swarmed the building, reporters shoved microphones into the faces of employees, and Richard's name echoed in every whisper. Though cleared by the FBI's sting, suspicions still lingered in the air, like smoke after a fire. But for Sarah, there was no rest at all. Her phone buzzed endlessly. Each time, it was Ryan. Threat after threat filled her screen. "You think you've won? You think that rich man can protect you? I'm Noah's father, and I'll take him away from you. Count on it." Every word chilled her blood. She sat at the edge of her bed, staring at Noah's peaceful face in the crib, her body aching with exhaustion but her mind refusing to close its eyes. When Richard knocked on the door the next morning, she opened it with dark circles under her eyes. "You didn't sleep," he said softly, studying her face. How could I, she whispered. He won't stop. He's not going to give up until he destroys me. Richard stepped inside, his presence filling the small apartment. He crouched in front of her, his eyes sharp but gentle. Then we end this, today, once and for all. By noon, Sarah found herself in a courthouse, the walls echoing with the shuffle of papers and the clipped heels of lawyers. She sat beside Richard, her hands clenched in her lap, her pulse racing. Across the room, Ryan leaned casually against his attorney, smirking at her with that familiar look of cruel confidence. The judge's voice cut through the tension. We are here to address the custody dispute of minor Noah Park. Sarah's throat tightened. The words felt like knives. This wasn't just a case, it was her son's future. Ryan's lawyer stood first, painting him as a father who wanted to reconnect with his child, a man unfairly cut out of his son's life by a desperate mother. Sarah wanted to scream, but she sat frozen, every accusation burning into her skin. Then it was her turn. Her lawyer rose, presenting the evidence Richard had painstakingly gathered. Screenshots of Ryan's threatening messages, records of his gambling debts, proof of his ties to William's schemes. The courtroom grew heavy with each revelation. Ryan's smirk faltered. Richard leaned close, whispering, "Breathe, Sarah. Just breathe." Finally, the judge looked directly at Ryan. "You endangered your child's welfare through threats and criminal associations. Custody will remain with the mother, and given the severity of your actions, you are under investigation for conspiracy to extort." The gavel cracked down. Ryan's face twisted with rage as officers approached, cuffing him as he shouted across the courtroom. "This isn't over, Sarah. You'll regret this." But Sarah didn't flinch this time. She held Noah's photo in her hand, her back straight, her eyes steady. For the first time, she wasn't just surviving, she was fighting, and she had won. Outside the courthouse, the sky broke into sunlight, scattering the storm. Richard placed a steady hand on her shoulder. "It's over," he said simply. Sarah's voice shook. "I don't even know how to thank you. If you hadn't—" He interrupted. "Ted, gently. You don't thank me. We did this together." The words lingered between them, heavy with unspoken meaning. Sarah searched his face, and for a moment, the noise of the city faded. His eyes weren't the cold, unreadable ones she had seen when they first met. Now they were warm, open, vulnerable. "Richard," she began, her voice faltering. He stepped closer, his presence overwhelming yet safe. "Sarah," he said, his voice low, "I've spent my life building walls. But you—" His eyes flicked toward Noah, then back to her. "You made me realize walls don't protect. People do. Families do." Her breath caught as his hand brushed hers. For weeks they had danced around this moment, buried under chaos and fear. But now, with justice finally in their hands, the truth was undeniable. When his lips touched hers, it wasn't just a kiss, it was a promise. Months later, Walker Enterprises had not only survived the scandal, it had thrived. With William gone, Richard reinstated as CEO, and Sarah promoted to Director of Internal Audit, the company rebuilt itself with renewed strength. Employees who once whispered now looked at Sarah with respect. But the greatest change wasn't in the office, it was in Sarah's heart. The day of their wedding dawned golden, sunlight spilling through stained glass windows as guests filled the elegant hall. Sarah stood in front of the mirror in her white gown, her hands trembling as she adjusted the veil. She had never imagined this moment, not after everything she had endured, not after all the nights she had cried herself to sleep in a dark apartment with nothing but fear for company. And yet, here she was. The music swelled, and the doors opened. Sarah stepped into the aisle, her eyes locking on Richard at the altar. He stood tall, dressed in a sharp black suit, his expression softening the moment he saw her. Halfway down, a sound broke the solemn air. A giggle, small and pure. Noah, now toddling on his untied foals, steady legs, had wriggled free from Margaret's grasp. Clutching a small pillow with the rings tied to it, he stumbled down the aisle, his cheeks flushed with joy. The crowd gasped, then laughed softly as the little boy ran straight into Richard's arms. But it was what came next that silenced the room. Noah lifted his tiny face, looked at Sarah, then at Richard, and shouted with a voice clear and proud, "Mom! Dad!" Tears blurred Sarah's vision. Richard's jaw tightened as emotion cracked through his polished composure. He held Noah close, then reached his free hand towards Sarah. When she placed her hand in his, the three of them stood together. No longer broken pieces of separate lives, but a family forged through fire, betrayal, and unyielding love. As the ceremony continued, Sarah whispered, barely loud enough for Richard to hear, "That wrong number. It saved my life. He smiled, leaning close. No, it gave us a life. And as they sealed their vows with a kiss, Noah clapped his little hands laughing. The sound filled the hall, echoing with a truth no one could deny. Sometimes the greatest stories don't begin with perfection. Sometimes they begin with desperation, a single mistake, and a message sent to the wrong number. And sometimes that's exactly what makes them right.